Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and we are continuing now with our conversation regarding that pivotal time period when the colonists are making their decision to fight or not to fight. Of course, we've already looked at the Declaration of Independence, and now on your hymnals on page 116, 117, we're going to be working with Thomas Paine's The American Crisis Number 1. We're only going to be reading a few lines from American Crisis Number 1. Let's get a little bit of background information before we take a look at this text. We definitely are going to want to talk about that cartoon on page 11, on 11.7. But before we get there, let's make sure we got our dates down for Thomas Paine. But the really important date for us with Thomas Paine in your notes, let's write it down right away, is in fact 1776. 1776, what a crucial year in the history of American thought, and yet now we're going to turn to the role Thomas Paine played in 1776, and it's right there on page 116 in that first paragraph. In January of 1776, Paine will publish, write down that title, that's an important one, Common Sense, 1776. You could make the argument, and many have, that no single piece of writing, other than maybe the Declaration of Independence itself, had such a powerful influence on the minds of colonialists. Why? Paine argued in Common Sense the exact same thing we're going to hear when we pick up American Crisis. Later in 1776, Paine begins to write a series of essays that he calls American Crisis, then he numbers them. We're going to be looking at just a few lines from number 1. Everything Paine has to say, though, can be reduced down to this comic on page 117. So let's take a look at it real quickly before we go to the reading, a close reading of this text. Notice your cartoon, and the most important thing about the cartoon, two things. One, notice the words Atlantic Ocean sit right in the center of the cartoon. Do you see that? And then secondly, we should point out headgear. Hats tell a lot for the people of 1776. Of course, you have an individual who has a certain kind of hat on, holding strings that are attached to a number of individuals. Notice on the eastern side of the Atlantic Ocean, right? Of course, this is who? George III, isn't it? Representing England. Of course, who's on the western side of the Atlantic Ocean? There are your colonists. Notice, interestingly, two things. You've got strings attached to them, but notice what the colonists are doing with those strings. Can you write that down in your notes at 3B, or 3A? We're obviously comparing one text, in this case a cartoon, to another text here in a moment, of course, American Experience, American Crisis. Notice that they're pulling back, aren't they? In other words, this cartoon will in many ways represent the primary thesis of anything that Paine was writing at the time. And in a word, it was simply this: fight. Fight. Okay? Now, there are a group of political thinkers. You want this in your notes. This is important to understanding Thomas Paine. There are a group of political thinkers named Tories. Tories. You want to write this term down? The Tories are colonists who remain loyal to Great Britain. Okay? Now, from earlier conversations, you could probably jot down why. And let's go ahead and ask you to do it. Why would colonists support England over people like, for example, Jefferson and Paine? Well, the answer is self-evident, isn't it? These Tories were very concerned with the political anarchy and chaos which might ensue if there was a revolutionary war of some kind, a war of independence. Paine is going to write specifically talking to the individuals in the colonies who say, let's just give England one more chance. Let's just give England one more chance. These are the times that try men's souls. Did you see the opening line right there on 11.7? Famous line. These are the times that try men's souls. In other words, Paine is going to argue Now is the time for us to stand up and fight. Our souls are being tried. In other words, they're being challenged. These are the times that challenge us. Later in American history, this term, these are the times that try men's souls, will be repeated several times. In other words, this is the time we all have to come together. And that's the second thing we want to say as we get ready to read this. We're going to have Paine saying to all the colonists, it can't be just one or two of us. It's got to be all of the colonies, all of the states, all of the people within those colonies. All of us have to come together. In a word, Paine is going to argue for unity. You want to write that down. Harmony, unity. Okay, write that down. That's an important idea. Paine is going to argue we all have to be together. Now, as we listen to a closed reading and we read along, I want you to jot down at level 1 the arguments that Paine will make. And this is an argumentative piece again. The arguments that Paine will make convincing Tories, those colonists who are a little bit leery about this. Now is the time. Now we have to go to war. We cannot wait to see if England is going to be true to whatever word they have said. Finally, 2 kinds of wars for Paine. You want to write this down. 2 kinds of wars. There is an offensive war and a defensive war. Okay? Now, there has been much in the history of philosophy spoken about the idea of a just war versus an unjust war. And normally this is the language that we're talking about. A just war is a defensive war. They hit me first. They hit us first. They were attacking us, therefore we had to respond. An offensive war is often referred to as an unjust war. In other words, you are going out of your way to start it. What is it maybe 1 or 2 of the adults in your life told you about being on the playground? Don't you start the fight, but if somebody starts it, you make sure you finish it. If you ever heard language like that, that's this philosophy. Paine's going to make the same argument. He is going to say to the Tories and the colonists who are a little bit leery to get involved in this project, hey, we didn't start this project. England started this project. All we're doing is finishing this project. It's our job to finish this project. In other words, not an offensive war, which, by the way, what he calls murder. He calls an offensive war murder. But a defensive war, although he doesn't use the term, is exactly what he's lobbying for. In other words, now is the time for us to go ahead and stand up together and to fight. The language here is so powerful. Are you ready for this? And this is, by the way, told to you on page 1116. On 11.6, page 11.6. The language is so powerful that General George Washington asks for this language to be read to his troops out loud before they go into battle. This is a classic example of what we will call, for your notes, propaganda. You write it, people read it, and they're trying to get some kind of political position or points. Washington understood this is some powerful language. It's very emotional language, as we will see in our study. All right, here we go. We're now ready to read. Again, don't just listen to it. Read along with it. Here we go. The American Crisis, number 1.
From the Crisis, number 1, by Thomas Paine. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. 'Tis dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then is there not such a thing as slavery upon earth? Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. I have as little superstition in me as any man living, but my secret opinion has ever been and still is that God Almighty will not give up a people to military destruction, or leave them unsupportedly to perish, who have so earnestly and so repeatedly sought to avoid the calamities of war by every decent method which wisdom could invent. Neither have I so much of the infidel in me as to suppose that he has relinquished the government of the world and given us up to the care of devils. And as I do not, I cannot see on what grounds the King of Britain can look up to heaven for help against us. A common murderer, a highwayman, or a housebreaker has as good a pretense as he. I once felt all that kind of anger which a man ought to feel against the mean principles that are held by the Tories. A noted one who kept a tavern at Amboy was standing at his door with as pretty a child in his hand, about 8 or 9 years old, as I ever saw. And after speaking his mind as freely as he thought was prudent, finished with this unfatherly expression: "Well, give me peace in my day." Not a man lives on the continent but fully believes that a separation must some time or other finally take place. And a generous parent should have said, "If there must be trouble, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace." And this single reflection, well applied, is sufficient to awaken every man to duty. Not a place upon earth might be so happy as America. Her situation is remote from all the wrangling world, and she has nothing to do but to trade with them. A man can distinguish himself between temper and principle, and I am as confident as I am that God governs the world, that America will never be happy till she gets clear of foreign dominion. Wars without ceasing will break out till that period arrives, and the continent must in the end be conqueror. For though the flame of liberty may sometimes cease to shine, the coal can never expire. I turn with the warm ardor of a friend to those who have nobly stood, and are yet determined to stand the matter out. I call not upon a few, but upon all, not on this state or that state, but on every state. Up and help us. Lay your shoulders to the wheel. Better have too much force than too little when so great an object is at stake. Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and the country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet and to repulse it. Say not that thousands are gone. Turn out your tens of thousands. Throw not the burden of the day upon Providence, but show your faith by your works, that God may bless you. It matters not where you live or what rank of life you hold. The evil or the blessing will reach you all. The far and the near, the home counties and the back, the rich and the poor will suffer or rejoice alike. The heart that feels not now is dead. The blood of his children will curse his cowardice, who shrinks back at a time when a little might have saved the whole and made them happy. I love the man that can smile at trouble, that can gather strength from distress and grow brave by reflection. 'Tis the business of little minds to shrink, but he whose heart is firm and whose conscience approves his conduct will pursue his principles unto death. My own line of reasoning is to myself as straight and clear as a ray of light. Not all the treasures of the world, so far as I believe, could have induced me to support an offensive war, for I think it murder. But if a thief breaks into my house, burns and destroys my property, and kills or threatens to kill me or those that are in it, and to bind me in all cases whatsoever to his absolute will, am I to suffer it? What signifies it to me whether he who does it is a king or a common man, my countryman or not my countryman, whether it be done by an individual villain or an army of them? If we reason to the root of things, we shall find no difference. Neither can any just cause be assigned why we should punish in the one case and pardon in the other.
To finish, notice he says, there are cases which cannot be overcome by language. In other words, we can't talk our way out of this one. And this is one. There are persons, too, who see not the full extent of the evil that threatens them. They solace themselves with hopes that the enemy, if they succeed, will be merciful. He's obviously talking about England, isn't he? It is the madness of folly to expect mercy from those who have refused to do justice, and even mercy where conquest is the object is only a trick of war. The cunning of the fox is as murderous as the violence of the wolf, and we ought to guard equally against both. Whoa, this is some powerful emotional language. Let's take a look at what he has to say. Notice these are the times that try men's souls is the way he begins on page 117. But then notice right away he uses the T word, tyranny. Notice these colonists, they like this word, tyranny, right? We heard Jefferson use this same word. In other words, there it is in our cartoon. You've got George III, and he wants to put ropes around everybody's neck and treat everybody as slaves. Jot down the irony of this fact. What's ironic about the fact that these people do not want to be treated as slaves? Right. Lots and lots of the people who didn't want to be treated as slaves themselves owned slaves. Right? And yet, be that as it may, it's a provocative argument. We will not, he says, we will not allow George III to treat us as slaves. Notice on page 11:7, what does it mean when it says, and this is an interesting idea, what we obtain too cheap, we esteem too highly. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. What does that mean to you? In other words, if your parents just give you a brand new car, as opposed to you have to work hard to get the brand new car, which one of the two situations do you actually respect the car? The argument he makes is, if we don't have to fight for something, we may not think of it as that important. In other words, it's worth the fight. Let's write it in our notes that way. He says it this way at 2a. It's worth the fight. It's worth the energy we have to give. Then he uses a very interesting word picture over on 11:8. He gives an example of a father who is holding his child. And he says, well, give me peace in my day. In other words, let's not do anything that disrupts the peace. Notice the response back by Paine is, whoa, way wrong answer. Not give you peace in your day, but what about the child that you're holding? Let's work to give peace to the next generation. One of the challenges, I think, of students today reading a passage like this is to realize this was the vision. The vision wasn't so much about we need peace, but rather generations to come need peace, right? That saying, freedom is not free, is of course buried right in the language that Paine will give here. By the way, did you notice as well, he uses the D word, duty? Just like Jefferson, we have a duty, an obligation to do this. Also notice 2 times in this reading he uses the word happy. We want to be happy, which is again quite remarkable. We commented on this, didn't we, when we were talking about Jefferson. Notice the great line to finish it on page 11:8. That great line to finish the second paragraph there. Wars without ceasing will break out till that period arrives, and the continent must in the end be conqueror. For though the flame of liberty may sometimes cease to shine, the coal could never expire. Whoa, what does that mean? We may not have a bright fire, but there's always the coal, the ember of freedom, the desire to be free. He says you can't wipe that away. The colonists will always want their freedom. Notice he continues by talking about not only having faith, but also having works. This is an allusion. I'm working 2b now. Allusion. An allusion or a reference to a biblical text from the book of James in the New Testament. The idea is It's not enough to just say you agree with the colonists in their plight for freedom. You also have to contribute, and that of course means you got to be a part of it. Then, on page 11:9, Paine's going to turn kind of a little bit nasty, and he's going to say, look at the top of that. The heart that feels not now is dead. By the way, I should point out, Martin Luther King Jr. will say almost the exact same thing later on in the fight for civil rights. If you do not have something, he said it this way, if you do not have something to die for, you have nothing to live for. Ooh. Ooh. That's exactly what he just said. Look at the line again. The heart that feels not now is dead. The blood of his children. Whoa, look at these lines. I hope you're paying attention to this. The blood, I'm at the top of 11:9. The blood of his children will curse his cowardice. Whoa. If you don't participate, notice this bandwagon argument, right? If you don't participate, your children will curse your cowardice. Now you can imagine if you're reading this and you're a little bit iffy or on the fence about whether we should go fight against Great Britain or not. No man wants to be called a coward. No man wants to be told that his children will call him a coward someday. Children who have not yet been born will call him a coward. So you can imagine how powerful this language is going to be. Notice he says something about little minds. We don't want to have little minds. We want to have big minds. There is an argument that's been made, and I'll let you decide whether it's true or not, that Americans learned to be visionaries early on in the experience of the colonial experience here, and especially the American Revolution, because so much of the language was about vision, the future, the future, the future. It's not about now. It's about what's coming in the future. In other words, in some ways, these people, like Paine, like Jefferson and others, they knew you guys were coming. But it was a long ways off in their future vision. 200, 300 years later, the argument was, there will be kids who will come to respect and understand the tough choice that we have to make now. Notice he says, I don't believe in an offensive war. That is murder, he says. But England has already started on us. We now must respond in kind. And that is to say, we've got to go to fight. Notice the use to be. Notice the use of the rhetorical questions on page 11:9. Do you see it? On page 119, he says, notice a series of these questions. He asks them. He says, if a thief break into my house and burn and destroy my property and kill or threaten to kill me or those that are in it, and to bind me in all cases whatsoever to his absolute will, am I to suffer it? Can you put that in your own words? What's he ask? Somebody breaks into my house and starts getting ready to kill me. What am I supposed to do? Just kind of stand there and take it? That's a rhetorical question. What's the obvious answer to a question like that? Yeah, no. Look at the next question he asks. What signifies it to me whether he who does it is a king or a common man, my countryman or not my countryman? In other words, it really doesn't matter to me who comes into my house and tries to kill me and take all my stuff. It's not like I'm going to analyze that part of it. I'm simply going to say, yeah, no, not up in here, in other words. Okay, we're going to take care of this business. Look at the third final one. He says, if we reason to the root of things, he says, we shall find no difference between these two. In other words, he says, we've got to fight. We don't have a choice here. Notice he finally finishes by saying, it is the madness of folly to expect mercy from those who have refused to do justice. What does he mean by this? He means for those who are saying, like the Tories, hey, England will be good to their word and they'll show us mercy. Paine will say, if they don't show us justice, how do you ever imagine they're going to show us mercy? There ain't no way that's going to work out. These are powerful words, and along with American Crisis, that the series of essays, he wrote again this essay, this important book called Common Sense. 1776. Lots and lots of people are moved by this language. All right, let's finish really quickly. We've already talked already about level 1 and level 2. Let's go to level 3 really quickly. Jot down for you your favorite film of fighting. Your favorite film where people stand up and say, we're going to fight. we're not going to sit idly by and let this happen. We've got to stand up. We've got to fight for what is ours. And about that fight, do they win in the movie, or are they defeated? See, this is interesting. So, for example, you might jot down a film like the famous film 300, which talks, of course, about the great Spartan conquest against the Persians. All 300 of them, of course, are slaughtered. You could argue that in the end it was a defeat. And yet, of course, we know the history there, right? There's always the second. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary, this text here will suggest, before others will stand up and fight. Okay? Of course, we could ask as well, and we might as well, because your textbook puts them together, what is the relationship between Declaration of Independence and American Crisis Number 1? Go ahead and write that down. What is the relationship between those two really quickly? How do you see any relationship? You're writing again at 3A. How do you see any relationship between Declaration of Independence and American Crisis? And then finally, let's go to 3B really quickly. Jot down, what are your thoughts about the idea that you must have something to die for to have anything to live for? That's a really interesting question. What is it that you're willing to die for in your life? In your family? In your town? In your country? For your world? Is there anything that you say, I believe so strongly that at this point, if I was asked to defend it with my life, I would do it, and do it willingly? Paine says if you can't answer that question, you've got nothing to live for. And if you've got nothing to live for, then you can't be happy, to use his language. What an interesting idea. And finally, do you buy the idea that kids should always have to work for the stuff they get? That if parents just give kids stuff, they will treat it too lightly. They won't think of it as being that important. Can you think of a time in your own life when this was the case? When maybe you were given something really nice and you just trashed it. But something that you really worked hard for and saved up all your money, you treated much better. Is it true that sacrifice makes us think more dearly of certain kinds of things? In other words, Paine says our hard work here will pay off because we will think of freedom as so much more precious. And finally, this question. Do you think American students today have a real appreciation of the amount of bloodshed and sacrifice that gave them the freedoms that they enjoy? Do you feel like students today, your age, understand that concept? Paine said kids of the next generations would look back to this time and respect these people for the sacrifices. Do you have a sense that's the case today? Or is America changing in regards to this issue of patriotism? What are your thoughts on that one? All right, there you go. An introduction to American Crisis, number 1.